Well, if you're new to our church, a couple things. One, you may not have noticed, but the brothers that you have praying before the sermon are elders, ruling elders in this church. Presbyterian church, presbyterian, is a word that means elder, and so it's an elder-led church. And so you'll see your elders praying. And so if you ever have questions, or if you want to be prayed for by one of your elders, or you just want to meet one, you'll notice that they're the guys who are up here praying before the sermon. The other thing I want to remind you of is we love your questions, and please feel free to ask one through the address on the screen. I got one that stumped me a little bit the first service, so we'll see if you can come up with an equally good question this morning. We're in Psalm 14, and I want to introduce it this way. Do you believe in God? And if so, why? That's really where the text takes us this morning. This psalm is, and again, it's in progress. We're going one after the other. We didn't choose this one because you're here this morning, right? This is the next one in order. But it really deals with the question of belief and how we believe and how reasonable it is to actually believe. Do you believe in God? I was reading some research on a project where clergy were given mind-altering hallucinogenic drugs. And then they were asked about their religious experience. So the idea was, well, if you give people hallucinogens, they'll tap into some part of their lives that are more believing, they'll have these experiences that connect them more deeply to God. And, the experiences were what you'd expect. There were liberal rabbis who were like, man, God has never been so loving. And then there were, celebrate priests who were like, I had a spiritually intimate experience that kind of shook me. And then you had Protestant hippies who were like, man, God's never been so cool as he was on my hallucinogen, right? All of those. I read this study half-heartedly because I know where these things are going, okay? And I read it half-heartedly because I find the idea that we have this deeper faith in God inside us that just needs to be unlocked. I find it very self-serving. That it just kind of relies on us, how believing we are, right? But there was one person's response that really struck me. And she was describing terror. That when she was on this drug and trying to connect with God, what she felt was his distance. She described it as a void. She said God was present, but it was like he was absent. He was present, but he was withholding himself, and she was terrified. We always assume that people under these conditions will have these great experiences, with God. But her experience was, what if God doesn't want anything to do with me? What if that's who he really is? And so she didn't want anything more to do with it. She was in a dark place. There's an unmissable point here in the psalm that we're about to read, which is that if God exists, we have to figure out what we're going to do with that information. You can indifferently disbelieve. In other words, you can believe that God is absent in an indifferent way. Just go on with everyday life. But you cannot really and truly believe that God exists and remain indifferent. C.S. Lewis, in ways that only he can put things, he put it this way. He said, in the end, and this is from his sermon called The Weight of Glory, in the end, that face, which is the delight or terror of the universe, it must be turned upon each one of us with one expression or with the other, either conferring glory inexpressible or inflicting shame that can never be cured or disguised. There is in the text this morning a kind of foolishness, but I want us to see it in a few different ways. There's the foolishness of unbelief we're going to see, but there's also the foolishness of Christianity. And finally, because those two things are true, there's a foolishness of the church. In other words, the way that we live as a result of this is a little unusual, a little foolish. So let's look at that together. Psalm 14, let me read it for you. The choir master of David, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man. And by the way, if you're wondering what that means for him to look down, the language is almost like as if he's looking through a window. Interesting. To see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge, all the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon the Lord? For they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. You would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of Zion, let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad. So the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And where I have to start from the very beginning is to say this. When we read that, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. We tend to read that as, well, he's kind of stupid, right? The fool, he's dumb. He doesn't quite get it. But that's not at all what the Hebrew language here in the Old Testament is telling us. Instead, it has this other picture. You know, like an animal skin that you would use for water or for wine in that day, a bag. The fool is the empty bag. In other words, the fool has nothing underneath the surface. That's what it means by foolish, that they have a kind of emptiness, that person is guided by the lack of something. In other words, that person is driven by something they cannot find or cannot satisfy. What the word here says is it says that this person says in their heart, not just verbally, but in their place where they determine their ethics and how they live, they say, in that place of guiding principles and vision and mission and values, I say there is no God. Now, that's a pretty strong indictment. Not only that, but that person then leads down this road of corruption. They lead down this road where they actually even, they kind of take out their way of not believing in God on the rest of the world. So first I want to say this, just so that we get it right. I don't want us to get it twisted. It's not saying that the fool is a fool because they don't believe in God. They're saying they're a fool and therefore they don't. In other words, their condition of foolishness drives their unbelief, okay? So I want you to understand that first of all. Their condition drives their unbelief. There's a kind of foolishness of unbelief here in the text. So the psalmist says they even go to this point where they devour the poor. They devour my people like they eat bread. And the question is, what is he talking about there? And I want you to think about it this way. What this person is doing is approaching the people of God or other people. They are approaching the world as an appetite that needs to be filled. Okay? Follow me. They're approaching the world as if it's something that they need to devour, that they can deal with it by virtue of their appetite. That person oppresses. That person oppresses because they are serving themselves. They are living, okay? They are living by their desire to fill themselves. They are living by the kind of serving of their own needs first. That is the atheistic way of life here, all right? They look at the world and they say, let me devour it like bread. I am saying this in a church on the Gold Coast of Long Island. I want it to sink in for a moment, the challenge. The Bible has an offense for everybody in all places at all times. And I think one of them is this. One of them is this. That the fool is led around by an absence that is self-serving, self-seeking. Long Islanders, and I include myself in this. As a matter of fact, there's a reason why I really love being here. Part of it is because, you show up in a place and you're like, these are my people. This is how I think, right? I mean, there's a degree to which, I am not Long Island, and I have to deal with that. There's a way in which I am, though, and I have to deal with that too, and it's this. We're expected to have our own lives together. We're expected to be competent. You don't know how many people I talk to in this church who say something like this. These people have their lives together. I don't know if I can be here because these people so have their lives together. So I'm going to ask you for yourself, if you can volunteer, who is it here that has their lives totally together? Who are you? Because I haven't met you yet. I've been a pastor here for almost 2 years. Anybody here that just has their lives totally together? I'm just looking. Okay, I don't see anyone. So we've already put that little lie to bed, okay? So now whenever you tell me, well, everybody seems to have their lives together, nobody here was willing to volunteer. Maybe you're just too modest, right? But I want you to think about that for a second. This is who we are. If you want to talk about the sin of living here, there's lots of goodness. I tell my poor family here, I can't believe we get to live here. So many times I'm just extolling what it means to live on Long Island. But you want to know what our sin is? I've investigated, and I've found it. And it's the same sin that everybody has, but it may be more pronounced here. It's this sin. This is the one. This is what you have to pay attention to, is the sin of presumption. What I mean by that is it's the sin that says, I get to decide. I get to decide what my life is about. I get to decide what's owed to me. I get to decide who I let in and who I keep out. I get to decide what's my property and what's not, what's my prerogative and what's not. Faith in Jesus will shred you if you try to hold on to two things at once. One, he is the God by whom, for whom, through whom, and because of whom all things were made, and he's never going to do anything that I don't allow him to do in my life and for the purposes that I determine are right and good and just. In other words, he is God and does what I want him to do when I want him to do it, and never contrary to my desires. I'm in control. Friends, that's the sin. That's where we say, like the atheist, there is no God. You want to know why this is here? You may wonder, what are they doing? The Psalms were Israel's hymn book. They were the godly people's hymn book. They weren't singing these songs to say, look at those ridiculous atheists. That's not what they were doing. They were reading them because they needed to be warned of their own kind of wandering, unlovely hearts that need to be the determiner of their own reality, that needs to be in charge all the time, that needs to determine what's what, and they needed to be told that that is the fool's way of living. It's the fool's way of living. It looks like you're in charge, but you're not. The psalm is written not to own the atheist. It's written to show us that the fool is some of us all of the time, and all of us some of the time. We have to be warned. How do we push against that? I'll give you just one way before we move on. The book of James, in James chapter 4, has this interesting place where James says, don't say, on this day I'm going to go and do this, and then I'm going to go and do this, and I'm going to accomplish this. You know this? It says, instead, say what? Anybody know? If the Lord wills. Good job, Grace. If the Lord wills. If the Lord wills, I'll go and do this. If the Lord wills, I'll go and do that. I put this in the questions for reflection. I just want to encourage you to do this. If you want to know where you are on the foolish spectrum, I want you to take your big plan for the next 12 months. I don't care what it is. I don't care how good it is. And I want you to say, okay, if the Lord wills. And I mean it needs to be something close to the bone, right? Makes you nervous even to talk about it. If the Lord wills. And then see how you feel about that. Does it fill you with dread? Make you concerned? You're living like the fool. I won't tell you what mine is. Too scary. But it's there. So, here's what happens in the text. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. he's really showing us something. He's saying the issue of faith is deep in the heart, and it's driven by an internal kind of emptiness. And that emptiness drives you to either deny God or to choose him. In other words, to pursue him, to believe in him, or to not. That emptiness and what happens to it is what determines that, okay? And so what's happening is it helps us to see it's not an issue of intellectual integrity. It's not an issue of arguments, although arguments can be extraordinarily helpful, and God uses those often to drive us to faith. But it's something else. George Carlin, the comedian. I'm not going to use all of George Carlin's language because I'm preaching this morning, but if you've noticed there inside the worship guide, there's a quote from George Carlin, probably the first time we've done that in the history of North Shore Community Church, and I'm going to read it to you, and I'm going to tell you why I'm really glad that it's there. Okay? Here it is. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do, right? This is right in the inside cover of the worship guide. If you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever till the end of time. But he loves you. He loves you. And he needs money. He always needs money. He's all powerful, all perfect, all knowing, and all wise, somehow just can't handle money. All right? Now, here's the dilemma. The presence of God, as George understands him, is a foolish burden. That God is a rule giver. He is an enthusiastic punisher, right? God's presence is a burden that you would have to be a fool to observe. That's what we see. But you've all heard that before, okay? But what Carlin does that's so interesting is he actually, without knowing it, makes the argument for why God's absence is a burden too. Not just his presence, but his absence. He argues for the absurdity of a God who is love, while also sending people to hell, but he doesn't argue that the loving, life-bearing God isn't desirable. In fact, he's arguing just the opposite. There's no comedy unless the desire for the love of God wasn't there. There's no punchline without it. So what George is doing is he's saying, look, it doesn't work this way, and you guys are idiots for thinking it does, but boy, if it did. You rubes, you fools, that believe in a God whose presence you could welcome. How foolish. But oh, if there was. If there was. He calls it foolish because it isn't possible, not because it isn't desirable. If God is not present, then we carry the burden of making our own lives matter, making them non-foolish, making them not empty. That's a burden. But if God is present, then his presence can be terrifying and full of wrath. We have to keep the rules. We have to follow. If we don't understand the gospel, then both his absence and his presence are a burden, and we want to run away. Carlin hits on this issue. With God, we have the burden of his presence. Without God, we have the burden of his absence. What does the Bible do with that? Well, there's another foolishness here, and it's not just the foolishness of unbelief. It's the foolishness of Christianity. It's the foolishness of faith. So look at verse 5. There they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. He says, the people who were fools, who believe there was no God, there will be a time when they will see the vindication of God's people. They will see. But what will they see? They won't see writing in the stars. They're not going to see some amazing, other kind of weird sign or whatever else. It's not going to be that everybody just suddenly, immediately believes in God. No, God will be present with the generation of the righteous. In other words, he's saying, actually, the presence of God, there's a way in which the presence of God is not an absence. Is not a burden. It's not something to be terrified about. It's actually your hope. God is with the generation of the righteous. What is the generation? He doesn't mean 20 or 30 years. He's not talking about the difference between the boomers, the busters, the Gen X, the Gen Y, the Gen Alpha, apparently, the Gen Z, the Gen whatever. Gen X is always forgotten. Gen X. No, it's not what he's saying. He's saying generation is a kind of person. It's a group of people. The righteous people are a type of people, all right? And for that reason, that means that you and I, when we see generation of the righteous, those of you who belong to Jesus by faith, you're actually a part of this generation that he's describing, even though we've lived 1,000 years later, right? What's happening here, what's really important in this text, is that you and I should be asking a very important question. If there's so much godlessness and unbelief, how is it possible that there's a generation of the righteous? How does that happen? It doesn't make any sense. We're given only one answer in the text. The answer in the text is God is with them. He is with the righteous. How are they righteous? God is with them. In the same way that the fool is not because he doesn't believe in God, but his foolishness leads him to unbelief, in the same way, this person is righteous not because of their belief, right? But because of their condition that has been changed. So what's the change? Paul borrows this language in Romans 3. By the way, there's Psalm 53 that uses the same language. So this is not an accident. This is not this is a one-hit wonder. God's people were supposed to think about this. Paul then takes this language and he uses it in an interesting way, because what he does in Romans 3 is he says, look, you used to think that the foolish were those who weren't Jewish, right? They didn't have the temple. They weren't looking by faith toward the sacrifice. And Paul says, listen, you Israelites, you have corrupted and destroyed this faith relationship that you had with the temple, and instead what you've made it into is a Jew-Gentile thing. And you who are so moral live like godless people. As a matter of fact, because you're so moral, you don't think you need God. So what does Paul say? He says, actually, it's righteousness that makes you belong to God. It is the gift of belonging to God. And he says none fall into this category. So what do we do with this? Well, the Bible lumps the outwardly moral and the outwardly immoral into this big cauldron together. And so we're supposed to ask, where does righteousness come from? How can someone be righteous? How can the empty person, right, who's led by their constant desires, how does that person get filled? There's a really good answer to that question. Religion says that God is present with us by the work of our goodness. We are good, so God is present with us, right? That's what religion says. But the gospel says this. The gospel says that God is present with us because of his acts, his works, the things that he has done. He makes us the generation of the righteous by his righteous acts. How is there a generation of the righteous? Because God is with them. God is with them. What happens here, and one of the things that just blows my mind, is that God meets the fool, the one who is being led by their absences, right? Just pursuing, seeking something. He meets us, and you know what Jesus does? He says, I'm going to do you one better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be the fool, in a way. I'm going to be the empty one. Philippians 2. Have ye this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself. Now, lots of people have argued, theologically, there have been a lot of arguments over the 2 millennia since this was written about what emptied himself means. And there are all kinds of bad answers to this question. We don't believe that Jesus ceased to be God. We need him to be God when he empties himself, okay? What we believe is that he set aside glory that was due him, and he took on the indignity of being the servant and suffering a death that he did not deserve. That's what he does. Empties himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, which, as I remind you, the Romans refused to own as an instrument of punishment that they came up with. They blame it on someone else. They just used it. It was that disgusting to Roman sensibility. Jesus humbles himself, empties himself. He meets all of us with our empty hearts, and he says, I will put myself out in order to be generous to you. What does he do with that? Christianity overcomes the challenge of God's presence or his absence by proclaiming a God who makes his presence redemptive instead of burdensome. He makes his presence the key. He shows up, and what he does is he acts redemptively. He doesn't ignore our sin. He doesn't ignore the demands of the law. Instead, he satisfies them, and he covers us in his own blood. This God empties himself for the empty. As a result, you and I are not only unburdened by his presence, or in his presence. We're not only unburdened in the presence of God, we're unburdened by the presence of God, not by us. He takes away the fear. He takes away the disaster of our unrighteousness. And by being present with us, he covers us. Friends, I need you to dial in on this, okay? This is the watershed point in Christian belief. Where your righteousness comes from is the primary question you need to answer as you interrogate the Christian faith. Many of you have been living your life as if your righteousness comes from being good, being approved of by someone that you love, being important, being competent, not making mistakes. Your righteousness cannot come from those places or you will be an empty bag. Your righteousness must come from the righteousness of Christ on your behalf. From Jesus. Do you hear me? 2 Corinthians 5:21, this must be your, if it's not your life verse, it needs to be like your second place life verse. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Who is this Jesus who says, I'm not going to turn away from the empty. I'm going to give them what they cannot get themselves. Do you see how that can change everything about how you live? If your righteousness comes from Jesus, you can risk everything in following him. You can do all the hard things that he calls you to because he has made you well. You can give up the kind of financial dream if you have to because you have a better dream. You can give up the dream of your kids always looking exactly how you wanted them to be or doing the things you wanted them to do. You can give up on the family thing altogether. It doesn't mean that God doesn't have it for you in the future, but it means you don't live and die by it because you have this righteousness that comes from Christ. You don't have to be led by your desires. You can be led by the belonging that you have in Jesus. C.S. Lewis, who talked earlier about how God looks at us, he also talks about how we should look at each other. And I want to remind you of part of his words, which is to say, those of you who are in Christ, if you're sitting next to somebody who is in Christ, you are sitting next to an unspeakable glory, a beauty that if you could see it in all of its realness, you would be tempted to worship it because you are covered in the righteousness of Christ. You cannot get there by being good. You cannot get there by being important or successful. You cannot get there by the power of your believing. It must be by the righteousness of Christ. Now, what happens? You've got a foolishness of unbelief. You've got the foolishness of Christianity. When those two things meet, you get this third thing, this foolishness of the Christian church. Verse 7 has this crazy hope. Oh, that the salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. I want to remind you that people have read this psalm when Israel was in exile, when Israel no longer existed, when they hadn't heard from a prophet in 400 years. They read this psalm, Christians read this psalm about God's deliverance, his awareness, his presence, when they were being thrown to the lions, when they were being murdered, martyred, when they were starving to death or dying of plague. Why? This is a weird thing about the church. All week, you and I, we live by whatever we've done, accomplished, what people say about us. We live by our frustrations or our disappointments in this world. We all do this. Then you show up on Sunday and there's this wholly new reality that you're supposed to understand, okay? It was one of the hardest things for me about following Jesus. When I first came to the church, my biggest objection was, these people are too happy. Not this church. I mean, when I was an unbeliever and came to church, I was like, these people are too happy. They're weird. They're singing. Why are they shaking my hand? They're smiling. I don't understand this, right? It was strange. When you show up in worship, what happens is that you measure what you believe to be true about the world and what you've been taught all week. You measure that against the truth that God gives us in his word, which is to say this: Zion is a homeland that by faith you already belong to and will one day belong to fully. I want to speak for a moment for those of you who are in that weird place where you're in only faith in your home, where there are other people who believe other things, where your heart breaks because you don't share that thing which is most important to you. And you may feel like you have been left off the map by Jesus. He doesn't care. You were ground to bits. I want to tell you what's true. You are already a part of a homeland that has been set apart for you. You already have a home. You already have a place. You already have a welcome. You have a God who has received you and has called you his own. I want you to hear that. Hear this psalm. The wonderful thing about Zion, this hope in Israel one day entering a homeland, that was the best that David could do. In Christ, we know it's this. We know it's belonging to Jesus. John 14 through 17, we're already connected to that homeland through Christ. We also know that that homeland will one day descend, the new heavens and the new earth. And there will no longer be any curse. Can you imagine? No longer any empty. Only the fullness of God. That's what you have to look forward to. So when we look at a passage like this that's a struggle and we think, how are we going to be the church? Be the church by being a little weird. Not unnecessarily weird. What I mean by it is this. You believe in things that many people don't believe in. You believe in a world that is to come, that will descend. You believe in a virgin birth. You believe in the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. I often find Christians are defensive about this fact. We should embrace it. Yeah, you believe in some crazy things. Don't mock other people. We believe in a virgin birth, okay? We're the crazy ones. That's okay. But we're crazy for good reason. What I want to encourage you to do as the church is that your calling is to be a certain kind of wisdom in a foolish world. But you're only going to get there by being seen as fools in all of those places, okay? Kids, students, you are going to be seen as fools for believing and following Jesus. Be the wisdom of God in those places. What does that mean? Let me read it to you. Another one to write down, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. Here's what it says. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to the Gentiles. Foolishness to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now, historians are in agreement about 3 ways that the church was foolish in a way that changed everything. Okay? 3 ways. 1, they proclaimed Jesus. They proclaimed a God who is crucified. No other system of belief like it. They proclaimed a God who is crucified by his own desire for the sake of his people who were his enemies. He died. They proclaimed Christ. That's 1. 2, historians are in agreement. Christians lived out their foolish lives and changed the world by eating together. Name your historian, Christian, non-Christian, they will tell you the same thing. The weirdness of the church was that different kinds of people who ordinarily would not be together were eating at each other's houses. They were eating at each other's houses. The third is this: they suffered. They didn't just suffer, they suffered for the outsider. There are all kinds of people who will suffer, okay? The suffering is the name of the game, being alive in this world. Suffering for the outsider is unique to Christianity. Suffering for the ones who don't already belong. That's what they did. They suffered for the fools. They suffered for the ones who said there is no God. So let me encourage you this way. Friends, our application this morning is that you and I are called to live foolish lives among those who believe they are wise. What that means is people in some ways should be puzzled by your way of life. Are you a fool? Are you a fool in the way that you welcome your neighbors, give of your resources, spend your time, treasure, and talents? Are you a fool in the way that you care for the poor? Are you a fool in the way that you endure struggle and suffering? Students, are you a fool by holding to the Christ in a world where people think that's insane? That's how the Christian church lives out its foolish life. And so I just want to encourage you to say, where are you living lives that are identified as foolish among your friends, neighbors, maybe the people in your own home that don't know Jesus? But I also want to leave you this morning with an encouragement as we end. If you're worn out this morning by holding to the faith in a day where you're seen as a fool, if you're worn out by those who you love dearly who just do not see the goodness of the gospel and you just yearn and you ache for them to know it, if it is breaking your heart, I want to draw your attention to Romans 8:32. Romans 8:32, this is another one to write down. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. In other words, he who emptied himself, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? How will he not also give us all things? It's not foolish to believe in this God who has been so gracious and generous It's foolish to believe that he's done being generous. It's foolish to believe that he's done being gracious. He has already emptied himself. Has he stopped being generous? No. Is he going to stop gracing you, upholding you, being present for you? No. So my friends, may his presence be lived out in your world. May you uphold the Christ in a foolish age.